and welcome to Prickly, a podcast from KJZZ's Politics Desk. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Giles.
I'm Wayne Schutsky.
And I'm Cameron Sanchez.
With the July primary in the books, it's time to look ahead to the general election in November. Today, we're going to be looking at who voters will get to choose from in some of the most consequential state and county races on the ballot. We'll discuss the handful of toss-up districts that will likely determine who controls the levers of power at the state legislature next year, and the candidates who are in the running to control Maricopa County over the next 4 years. Republicans have controlled both the Arizona House and Senate for decades, and while Democrats have been talking about changing that dynamic for years, they have little to show for it. Cameron, is this really the year Democrats can do this, or is this just more bluster from the left?
It's kind of like the boy who cried, we're going to win the legislature, where they sort of say it every 2 years, but then, even though they have a chance every single time, you can't say for sure. I think that in the Senate, at least, yes, I would say the Democrats do have a fair chance of, if not winning the whole chamber and getting a decent majority over Republicans, then potentially evening it up so that it's a split of, maybe 15 and 15. Also, there's quite a few races this year that we're keeping track of. In Legislative District 2, we have Republican Shauna Bullock going up against Democrat Judy Schwiebert. So Bullock was appointed, and she's been serving in the legislature. She's been a former lawmaker. And Schwiebert is a longtime lawmaker, a teacher, and they're vying for the same spot. So Schwiebert is in the House now, but she's looking to get into the Senate and sort of bump Bullock out of the way. That's a really important race, and it's maybe the most competitive in the state of Arizona to keep track of. That could very well be the key for Democrats.
What about some of the longer shots for Democrats?
Definitely Legislative Districts 13 and 16. We've watched them for a while now. There are some really strong incumbents there, though, and that's what makes them a little trickier, I think. So we've got J.D. Mesnard and T.J. Shope. Those are both incumbent Republicans. They've been around for quite a long time. They've built relationships with the community, with other lawmakers. I think they'd be quite difficult to budge, but the Democrats have tried it and put some money into those races in the past couple cycles. So there's a chance.
And in southern Arizona, LD 17 is going to have a bit of a shakeup no matter what. But let's talk about the implications of an old face coming back into the picture.
Right. So in Legislative District 17, which is down in the Tucson area, the incumbent, Senator Justine Wadsack, just lost her primary to Republican former lawmaker Vince Leach. And he has been gunning for that seat since she took it from him in the most recent election before that one. So he's kind of reclaimed his place. And I think Democrats were hoping that if Wadsack won, she's sort of known as a so-called MAGA Republican, member of the far-right Freedom Caucus, that they would maybe have a better chance at ousting her and actually getting a Democrat in there, which would have been quite the upset. But with Leach coming back, I think Democrats' chances have dwindled a little bit to pick up that seat because I think he's going to be able to pick up more support from Republicans and maybe even a few independents.
All right, so we've looked at 4 districts where Democrats are hopeful maybe they can pick up a seat, but there's also some competitive districts where Democrats are going to be playing defense.
Yes, so there are a couple of districts. Senator Christine Marsh in Legislative District 4 and Senator Ava Birch in Legislative District 9. So those are currently held by Democrats, very, very competitive, and they're going to be tricky, but both Marsh and Birch have been preparing for this for quite a long time, and they have quite a bit of money. So Marsh is, I would say, pretty well liked in her district. She's a teacher. Birch made headlines this year talking about abortion when that was a huge issue at the Capitol. I'd say they both have a good shot of keeping their toehold.
Gotcha. And it's worth noting that Democrats last tied the chamber up in 2001 and 2002, but both chambers have remained in Republican control ever since then. Let's shift gears to the Arizona House. Wayne, could we see a legislature with even splits in both chambers?
It's not out of the realm of possibility that the Democrats bring it even or even take control in the House, but it's probably even more likely that the division there remains the same, where Republicans have a slight advantage over the Democrats. That's because there's competitive districts in many of the same races that Cameron mentioned in the Senate. But the House elections are chaotic, unpredictable. You've got 2 candidates in a lot of cases running from each party. Voters can get unpredictable when they're deciding which of those they're going to go with. But it is easy to look ahead and see that the Democrats are relying on a lot of newcomers to defend or win some of these competitive races. And that's because we've just seen such a flurry of resignations down at the legislature, especially in the House, and folks choosing not to run for re-election.
Let's talk about some of those districts where we did see in the last 12 months, a lot of Democrats bow out at the legislature. What are some of the key tough seats that newcomers are going to be trying to hold on to?
So a big one is Legislative District 4. That is a Phoenix, Scottsdale, Paradise Valley area district that is one of the most competitive in the state, where we see split representation right now. That's a Democrat in the Senate, and then a Democrat and a Republican in the House of Representatives. But that Democratic House rep, Laura Tarrick, resigned. So now in that district, the Democrats are relying on former lawmaker Kelly Butler, along with a newcomer named Karen Gresham, in an attempt to at least hold their one seat and maybe take a second seat.
Where are there other pickup opportunities for Democrats in the House?
I think one of the best opportunities for them is taking a seat that's currently held by Republican Michelle Pena in Legislative District 23, which covers a lot of the Yuma area. And that's because she was kind of a surprise winner last time around. Democrats outnumber Republicans in that district, though there are also a lot of independents there. Nobody really expected a Republican to take that seat last time around. So now that Democrats are paying a little bit more attention and putting more money and resources into that seat, I think it's a really good opportunity for them to pick that up. But at the same time, they're vulnerable of losing other seats. Again, as Cameron mentioned, LD 13 in the Chandler area is very competitive. And we've got two newcomers who are facing Julie Willoughby, a Republican who was appointed to that seat. And then she's got a running mate in Jeff Wenninger, who is a former lawmaker, very well known in the district, was a Chandler city councilman. So Democrats are going to be facing some uphill battles holding on to a seat there. And then we've got Keith Seaman in Legislative District 16, which is down in parts of Pinal County and on the edges of Maricopa County. He kind of won a surprise seat in that district, but now he's facing what I think many believe is a more formidable Republican opponent in Renee Lopez, who's a little bit less controversial than the opponent that Seaman defeated the last time around.
And what about that Tucson area district, LD 17? We did see an upset in the GOP Senate primary there. How did the races shake out in the House?
It wasn't like in the Senate. The two Freedom Caucus incumbents, who are Cory McGarr and Rachel Jones, who are very much friends, allies of Justine Wadsack, who lost out on the Senate side, both won in their primaries. So Democrats believe that they could peel off one of those seats running a Democrat by the name of Kevin Volk. They think that he is kind of a more moderate Democratic choice that some moderate Republicans might prefer to the far-right incumbents they've got currently.
Lots of scenarios that could play out here in the general election. Wayne and Cameron, you'll be all over those races for the next couple of months. For the sake of argument, let's say one of the chambers ends up with an even 50-50 split. That would be 15-15 in the Senate or 30-30 in the House. Cameron, could you explain how that would work? Because that's not a situation that we've seen down there for a long time. And how would a tie shift the dynamics at the state capitol?
Well, if you have a tie, you're going to need to figure out how to work together. And that sounds difficult to me, based on my experience watching these people at the Capitol. So you're going to have most likely some agreement to come to the table, maybe some moderates rising to the top and sort of taking on leadership positions to get everyone on the same page for doing things like the budget, for example, because it can't be a total gridlock. You know, every year the legislature has to come in and get some stuff done. I think effectively, though, there would be some most likely gridlocking issues. Right now, we have a completely Republican-controlled legislature, but a Democrat in the governor's office, and we've seen plenty of friction, especially in Governor Hobbs's first year. And that was the year where, you know, Republicans threw up a lot of bills at her that they knew she was going to veto, and there was, you know, lots of vitriol and insults. And I think it's still similar, although they've gotten more used to one another. And in the legislature, I would expect sort of a similar dynamic. The Democrats in the state legislature now have, I would say, the least amount of power between, you know, themselves, the Republican lawmakers, and the governor, because even though they have a Democratic governor, they're often not included in conversations about what legislation makes it all the way, and they aren't included in the decisions about running things down at the Capitol, which is actually very important. So one of those things is whoever's in leadership gets to pick who is in charge of the committees. And those committees can kill bills by just not hearing them at all. So, for example, Democrats every year will put up legislation that never gets a hearing. If it gets assigned to a committee, the committee chair can just let it sit there and then it dies without anyone actually voting on it. But if Democrats and Republicans were sharing the responsibility of managing the state Senate, for example, then maybe the Democrats would get to pick who runs the Appropriations Committee or the Natural Resources Committee or the Housing, Commerce Committee. And they could actually potentially, long shot, get something done that's been sort of sitting in purgatory for the past several sessions.
So it sounds like a split even could give Democrats a rare foothold when it comes to trying to push some of their agenda items through the legislative process.
Exactly. They would have bargaining chips.
That's exactly right. Even if they don't, for instance, get one of their members named as the Senate president, it still gives Democrats the power to say, hey, if we're going to put your guy or woman in the position of power, then you have to let these bills that we support see the light of day. I mean, as Cameron mentioned, the party in power typically can delay bills to the point that they never get a hearing and they just kind of die off. Something like the repeal of the territorial era abortion ban. Democrats have introduced that for years, and it didn't get a hearing until there was so much public pressure on the legislature that kind of forced Republicans to let that see the light of day. Another issue could be the Dino Committee. That's the committee that approves Governor Hobbs' nominees to run state agencies, where we've seen a lot of controversy lately because a far-right Republican Senator Jake Hoffman is the one running that committee. He's given Hobbs a very hard time. Potentially, we could see Democrats negotiate to have a more moderate member of the Republican caucus lead that committee or even one of their own.
A split majority in either chamber could bring a bit more civility to the committee hearing process for sure in 2025. We're going to take a quick break, but we'll get right back and move on to Maricopa County. You're listening to the Prickly Podcast. Welcome back to Prickly, where we're going to move on to Maricopa County races. In Maricopa County, we saw two prominent Republican incumbents defeated by challengers from their own party in the primary last month. That includes Maricopa County Recorder Stephen Richer, who was defeated by Republican State Representative Justin Heap, a member of the Freedom Caucus who has flirted with disproven claims of widespread election fraud. Wayne, how did Heap pull this off?
Yeah, I think Heap was seen as a bit of an underdog going into this race because he's a first-term state legislator who doesn't really have any experience in election administration and the type of things that are the responsibility of the recorder's office. But basically what happened is MAGA Republicans turned out in their primary and chose their candidate. He had the backing of the Freedom Caucus that we talked about before and all of the groups that have promoted these disproven conspiracy theories about election fraud. And they believe, the recorder does have a role in election administration, so they wanted to put one of their own in that job. Now, Heap has stopped short of saying whether he believes elections are stolen in the past, but he definitely associates with the type of people who are promoting these conspiracy theories and had endorsements from folks like Kari Lake who are still pushing them to this day. And if we look at the election results, Heap beat Richer by about 9-10 percentage points, but there was a third candidate in the race named Don Hyatt, who's also in this kind of election fraud wing of the party, even further than Heap maybe, and he got 22% of the vote. So if we're really looking at it, the MAGA election stolen wing of the party won this race by like 30%. And, that was kind of a resounding defeat and kind of shows you where the Republican Party in Maricopa County is right now. And it has huge consequences because the recorder is the one who controls early voting in Maricopa County. Doesn't control all election activities, but does have a huge hand in voter registration and early voting and those type of things. Now, I'm always quick to tell everyone that the recorder also has a ton of non-election related responsibilities, including recording all your documents like the deed to your house. So That also will affect people on an everyday basis, but the headlines here are on a person associated with the election denial movement in a position to run elections in the county.
So, Cameron, does this mean a MAGA candidate will soon be running early and mail voting in Maricopa County?
Not necessarily. So there is another candidate. So there's a Democrat. His name is Tim Stringham. He's kind of a newbie. Not a lot known about him. He's never been a lawmaker before or a politician, really. He's been in the Army and the Navy, and he's the challenger now going up against Heap. So he's the person that Democrats are putting all of their support behind in this race to make sure that it's not Heap, because they really want to avoid that at all costs. Plus, he's a Democrat, and they're going to try to get him the support of independents, and I think he's being pitched as sort of like the common sense option, the keeping elections secure, but also saying that they're already secure option. And that, it's not over till the fat lady sings. You can't know for sure. I think that there's going to be a really big push on this race this year, more than we've seen in the past.
How possible is it that Richard's supporters and defenders might support a Democrat this time around to avoid, as you said, a Heap county recorder situation?
Honestly, I really do believe that. I think Richer has a lot of supporters who are maybe not as loud about their support, but who are put off by the election denialism and the hatred that so many of the county officials have faced for the past, not 2 years, but 4 years now. And it's getting a little old, I think, for a pretty decent chunk of voters who would, for an office like this where culture war stuff doesn't really matter, maybe be willing to vote for a Democrat this time around.
A few years ago, we saw Democrat Adrian Fontes win Secretary of State, and what a lot of Republicans who were supporting him at the time told me was that they were comfortable voting for a Democrat because this job is really elections. This job is, not political. So even though they might disagree with him on a lot of policy issues, what they don't disagree with him on is that the elections weren't stolen and that elections need to be protected. And so I could see the same thing happening here, where they're looking at this job that they really don't think should be political. So they're comfortable voting Democrat in this one race, maybe only because they're put off by the election denialism, as Cameron said, and they see a guy on the other side who's just trying to make it, run these elections fairly and protect the vote.
A partisan election for an arguably nonpartisan office. But Wayne, as you mentioned earlier, the recorder only controls one aspect of the county's election administration. The Maricopa County Board of Supervisors is in charge of election day voting, and the current board, comprised of 4 Republicans and 1 Democrat, have all been steadfast in their defense of the county's election system in the face of criticism from allies of former President Donald Trump, U.S. Senate candidate Kari Lake, and others who claim continually, without evidence we should say, that the county's elections are marred by fraud. Cameron, not all of those incumbents will be back in 2025, though.
So there are 2 incumbent Republican supervisors who didn't seek re-election this year, and that's Clint Hickman and Bill Gates. So in the primary election, the Republicans who did well were Congresswoman Debbie Lesko in the Hickman district, and then former lawmaker Kate Brophy-McGee for the Republican primary in the Gates district. Now, Hickman and Gates have been steadfast with the recorder and the other supervisors that the elections have been safe and secure, and this exit constitutes a shakeup no matter who replaces them. But Lesko, in particular, she hasn't been loud about saying whether she thinks the elections were outright rigged and stolen, but she certainly hasn't discouraged that and also aligns herself with a crowd who does say it more aggressively with their full chest. She did very well in her primary election. She got a huge percent of the vote. She's expected to take the whole thing. Former lawmaker Kate Brophy-McGee is running in a more competitive general election against Democrat Danny Valenzuela, who is going to maybe give her a run for her money. She has name recognition as a former lawmaker, but he has name recognition as a former city councilman.
There was another incumbent who did run for re-election but was defeated in the primary. Can you take us through, Cameron, what happened to soon-to-be former supervisor Jack Sellers?
So Sellers is another one of these longtime Republicans who's kind of been, I think, fed up with the election denialism, and he took an upset by Chandler Councilman Mark Stewart, who's a fellow Republican in the primary, so Sellers will not be moving on. He is also the chair of the County Board of Supervisors and just recently certified his own loss.
Wayne, is Mark Stewart's victory in November assured, or could we see more Democrats on the Board of Supervisors in Maricopa County next year?
No, it's entirely possible that the Democrats take over the Board of Supervisors this time around. Sellers won his election in 2020 by just a few hundred votes. And now you have Mark Stewart running for the same seat against Joel Navarro, a former Tempe councilman who has a lot of name recognition in the district as well. And again, kind of like some of these other candidates we've talked about, Stewart hasn't outright said he believes elections were stolen in the past, but he has criticized election administration. And he's kind of sitting on the fence on this stuff, again, which could alienate some moderate Republican voters and maybe push them over to Navarro's side. And then in the other race that Cameron mentioned with Kate Brophy-McGee and Daniel Valenzuela, we've got another very competitive district with two very well-known candidates. Now, Brophy-McGee, I should say, is a moderate Republican. She's not known to be part of this election denial movement, but we still could very well see a Democrat take that seat as well. So as much as we may have a few folks connected to the election skeptic side take seats on this board, we could also see Democrats take control of this board. There's a lot of options out there.
And Cameron, there was one Republican incumbent who did manage to survive the July primary. Tell us about Thomas Galvin's journey to re-election.
Right. So Galvin faced a challenge from former lawmaker Michelle Ugenti-Rita, and she's a pretty hard right conservative and spent quite a bit of the last year criticizing Galvin and the Board of Supervisors for a variety of their decisions. She's pitched plenty of election reform legislation at the Capitol. Some of it made it through, and she accepted her loss. Galvin has been pretty vocal in his staunch support, like the other supervisors of the elections. He actually got into it with a woman at the county canvass earlier this month who was claiming that our elections, Arizona's elections, are not as secure as in other countries. And he actually spoke back to her and told her that she's wrong. And he's been doing that, I would say somewhat consistently, maybe more and more as things have progressed and as the supervisors get more tired of the constant claims of election fraud, even in the primary election, which went pretty smoothly.
All right, beyond the Board of Supervisors, beyond the Recorder's Office, are there any other elected offices in Maricopa County where we're expecting a leadership shakeup?
Yes, there's one big one where we know there's going to be a leadership shakeup. So that's the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. Our Maricopa County Sheriff is a guy called Russ Skinner, and he just lost his primary election. So there's a Democrat, Tyler Kemp, going against a Republican called Jerry Sheridan. So Sheridan is pretty well known in that circle because he worked in Joe Arpaio's office, and Joe Arpaio was very famous as Arizona's tough on crime sheriff in the era of SB 1070, made a lot of headlines. Sheridan is sort of known as his guy, and I don't believe that Arpaio endorsed him, but Sheridan has that experience, and, Camp ousting Skinner is interesting for a couple reasons. One of them is that Skinner had changed his party affiliation right before he took over for former Sheriff Paul Penzone, who was a Democrat. And in order to replace Penzone when he left, he had to be replaced with someone of the same political party. So Skinner, at that time, changed his party affiliation to Democrat and took over the spot.
All right, lots of new elected officials in the mix in Maricopa County, as well as the state legislature. Thank you to both Wayne Schutsky and Cameron Sanchez of the Politics Desk for tracking all of these races and for continuing to do so over the next couple of months. And thank you for listening to this episode of the Prickly Podcast from KJZZ's Politics Desk. Tune in to 91.5 to hear our coverage on air of the general election and more. You can also follow our coverage online at kjzz.org, and please subscribe to the Prickly Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.